I'm going to be diving a little deeper into challenge-based learning and how challenge-based learning can really be connected and integrated into your content area. So I'm throwing around this term of challenge-based learning. That's because the Ciena Solutions Challenge utilizes challenge-based learning to provide students with opportunities to engage with, to investigate and learn more about, and then to take action on a challenge that they're facing within their community. And challenge-based learning is a framework for learning. It's really focused on engaging students in community-based problem solving around real-world challenges. So allowing students to think about what's happening in my community and how can I take action and problem solve around this. The framework fuels collaboration to identify a big idea, thoughtful questions, and really investigate and solve those challenges. But the great thing is that challenge-based learning is not a subject in and of itself. It really is a framework. And that being a framework gives it some flexibility for integration. Challenge-based learning provides flexibility for student agency as well. So it allows students to select the problem they're going to solve, like I talked about earlier, the questions that they choose to investigate, the methods that they choose to investigate, and opt to solve problems that they identify. And the great thing about this is that you can do challenge-based learning with no constraints, and students can pick any method and any challenge, or there can be some constraints that allow it to fit within your content area. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the flexibility really provides opportunities to integrate the framework right into your content area, no matter what that content area is. I want to quickly run through a few ideas. This comes from our facilitator's guide. So if you have more questions, we're going to be talking about resources later, and I'll show you where in the resource library that facilitator's guide is linked. But the content connections, that some of the ones we've thought about, for instance, in language arts, students might develop a written or oral synthesis of their investigations. They're going to be reading probably some technical or primary sources, and they might write content that goes on a web page that becomes the script of a podcast. In mathematics, you might have students who are using descriptive statistics to analyze some data. You might have students who are collecting and analyzing, creating graphs of survey data. Connected to science, there's opportunities to do experiments around natural phenomena that are related to the challenge, depending on what that challenge is. In social studies, students might connect to primary sources and research within their community, as well as engaging with local government leaders to advocate for change and learning more about how the local government works. Related to the arts, a lot of student outputs could be done on a graphic design software, or could be done with audio mixing software. So there's a lot of opportunity to connect the arts there. And if you're teaching a computer science class, students might be developing an app to take action to make change. These are just a few examples. This is in no way an exhaustive list, but I wanted to just start by throwing out some of these ideas, some of these ways that any challenge can be connected to any or all of these different content areas. And if you want to explore more, on our website, we have developed a page of content connections specifically tied to standards in different subject areas. So you can see examples and ideas of standards that align and ways that challenge-based learning can really start to align to those standards. But you might ask, how is this all possible? And so I wanted to show you some example projects from teams that completed the challenge last year. We know that examples from other educators like yourself are probably the best way to see how to connect to your content area. So I'm going to go through 5 examples, give kind of a quick overview of some things that we saw. So students from a high school in San Jose, California, worked in their multimedia arts class on the challenge. And so they engaged around the challenge of global warming. And as media creators, the students turned their ideas into visual stories. They created buttons, so different multimedia pieces using those multimedia art skills that they'd been learning. And at the end of the project, students wrote, produced, and recorded their own podcasts to broadcast their story to the community and a larger audience. And so those outputs were all in alignment with the goals of that media arts class, and gave a context in an authentic way for students to be practicing the skills they were learning. Students in Lagos, Nigeria developed the Vikapot refrigerator to solve the challenge of food poisoning and harvest waste. So they worked in their chemistry classes to integrate science and art to develop a solution that used materials locally available and sustainable within their community to develop these small refrigeration systems that individuals and farmers could use, and brought in those science skills and the science knowledge that they had been learning into this project, which stays cool through a process of evaporation. Students at a high school in Ottawa, Canada, focused on the challenge of mental health and developing a website of resources and activities to support their students. They worked in their business class, and so they needed to gather information from other students about what the students would want or need, which is similar to the process of doing some market research before you develop any product. And they collaborated with organizations and offices across their school to bring together their final action. And another example, a school in Brazil worked on their challenge within their English as a second language class. And so working on the challenge gave students an authentic and practical environment to practice English skills as they work towards their action. But I want to reiterate what Carissa said. While this is an example of how an English as a second language class could be a great place to integrate the challenge, as students are getting opportunities to practice English, the challenge doesn't have to be in English. So if English is not the language that your students are most comfortable communicating in, students can work on the challenge in any language they want. And you can, as a teacher, translate or work with others in your community to translate some of the content that needs to be turned in for our judging in English. But we really want to emphasize that not every product needs to be in English, because we know that as a global challenge, the majority of communities are speaking languages other than English, and we want this to be really authentic to your communities. So our final example is from a middle school that has a project-based learning focus, and they were able to integrate the Ciena Solutions challenge into all of their core classes. So today we're joined asynchronously by Jesse Rhodes, who's a middle school social studies teacher in Idaho in the United States. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to join us today because he is teaching and running parent-teacher conferences during this webinar, but he shared some recordings answering questions with us so that I could share with you guys a little bit more about their process, about what they did, and some of the exciting things that him and his fellow teachers did as they led all of their students through the Ciena Solutions Challenge last year. So he's going to share a bit about his experiences and their work. We'll start by hearing an example of how he integrated CBL into his class.
So we are a project-based learning program at our school. And so last year we did kind of incorporate it into all the core classes by trying to make a project that connected to the content they were learning. So like, for example, our eighth graders were learning all about the Industrial Revolution. And so it made a lot of sense to talk about sustainability and like the impacts that, like even really like the negative impacts that, that maybe like industrialization and urbanization has had on the planet.
So as you can hear, in order to fit in his content area, which was social studies and history, Jesse and his team put some parameters on what the students could choose. So in reaction to their discussion of the Industrial Revolution and the impacts on the planet, they focused on sustainability and selected a big idea for the entire grade. And that's a practice that is not only useful when integrating into your content area, but can also help students within your class, especially students who might struggle with decisions or get overwhelmed with too many choices. Sometimes putting a parameter like that can be helpful and can help steer your students' challenges without limiting their own student agency, which we'll hear more about in just a second. So as you guys might know, with the Ciena Solutions Challenge, we ask teams to think about and make connections to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so within the confines of this overall topic of sustainability, Jesse had his students choose their focus and make connections with those sustainable development goals.
we had the kids choose some of the goals. Really, like they had to narrow down to one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and which, I mean, fits really well into that, into that thought. So it was kind of like at the end we planned it. It wasn't super perfect or anything like that, but we planned it more as a project that would happen at the end of that unit, like at the end of learning about the Industrial Revolution and urbanization and all that.
And not only did Jesse share about how he used topics, in this case, the Industrial Revolution, to align the Ciena Solutions challenge to his class, but him and his fellow teachers who taught math, science, and English also aligned the challenge as much as possible to the standards that they were trying to meet. Now, I will say aligning to standards, as you'll hear Jesse also say, wasn't always easy, but it was possible, and they were able to find these alignments.
My opinion is if it fits, go for it. I mean, we definitely have standards that align with, understanding how, how the rise of urbanization has impacted the world, so for some, it was very simple to connect it to an essential standard. I'm a history teacher. Our ELA teacher has a really easy time connecting whatever, if they're going to have to write, and there's a lot of standards connected to that. We really, spent a lot of time wrangling the three of the contents for sure, like science and ELA and social studies were pretty tight, I honestly think. But it was hard. It's hard to get, and we're dialed in pretty good as a team, our team of teachers, but it's a lot of work to get everybody on the same page and stuff like that. So our math teacher, it is a stretch, to get some of the math standards to fit in with a challenge-based learning, but it was kind of like she just made sure she was hitting the standards and then came back and made the project happen.
So they were able to align topics, they were able to align standards. But one really important part of the Ciena Solutions Challenge is we want students to have choice and agency over their projects. We really don't want these projects to be a teacher directing exactly what's happening all the time, because we want students to be able to see how they can make change within their communities. And so they did. The teachers allowed some flexibility for students to make choices, have agency over their projects, while still fitting into the overall structure of the class and the standards they were trying to meet.
The kids came up with just different goals of how to, not change the urban climate and all that, but to look at how are companies investing in climate change was one. So we had kids that that tackled some questions about climate change, and some looked at urban infrastructure and stuff like that.
Now, we know it's possible, but what does the structure look like? Great question. So the teachers at West Middle School organized their students into advisory teams. So while all teachers were integrating into their content area, into the project, each student had a go-to person, each team had a go-to person to support them. Jesse can tell us a little more about that.
We're already kind of set up in our school where kids have an advisor. And so we did kind of change the title a little bit. We called the teacher a project manager. And so the kids did have a portfolio, like a paper hard copy portfolio of things they would do on paper. And then we had an electronic version of it. We used Microsoft Teams and Class Notebook. So the kids had a lot of stuff organized in that as well. Anything that they were working on kind of went into that.
And just as the teachers at West Middle School became the project managers for their students, students can also take on some of these project management tasks. You could have a certain student who's the project manager, a certain student who's the note taker within their group. And some educators we talked to last year even shared that they had a designated role for the student who was in charge of checking in with their educator leader and sharing their group's progress. So they had someone who was kind of the progress reporter every week or every day to ensure that educators knew what their different teams were doing without having to talk to everyone at once. Jesse shared that if they do the challenge again this year, they've adjusted their overall school schedule because of their focus on project-based learning. And so they actually have a designated time when students would get to work with their project groups.
Now is we kind of have, like, in our little program, we have 85 kids, something like that. And we're more like operating off of these themes, but like we're setting aside a day a week for the project-based learning. And so, you know, if we do it again and again, we need to talk about how we're going to do it. But if we do it again, it's going to be like we have this one day a week set aside where most of the day you can be, you know, doing your research or setting up your interview, working on your action phase.
And so while we know that's not possible at every school, that not everywhere will be able to set aside this time, it's a really interesting way to think about it, that if teachers are working together and split up kids in classes, that there is a way to potentially create some designated time, because we know if you teach 40 minutes at once, 50 minutes at once, students might not have enough time. We asked Jesse to reflect on some of his favorite parts of the process and projects that stood out to him. And when thinking back to the projects that were done last year, Jesse shared that his favorite part was how students were able to connect with community members in their local community.
We had almost every kid interviewed somebody in the community, and like it was amazing. So like one kid got it in his head that he was going to interview the mayor, and so we got the mayor to come, and it was after COVID. It was actually her first public appearance, right? So here comes the mayor as the first interview of like all these different projects that the kids are kind of thinking about. And I mean, she just nailed it, and everyone went and listened in. So then we probably had 30 different people that kids interviewed from. We had people from like we had the city. Our city is about 100,000 people, and the kids, one of the groups was looking at kind of this, you know, how to keep this park moving forward, and kind of keep the natural habitat and stuff. And so they called the city arborist, and the city arborist came and like did an interview with the kids. We had the owner of Toyota, one of the owners, it was like the owner's son, the vice president of the Toyota dealership, came on Zoom and did an interview with kids about like hybrid cars and electric cars and stuff. And so it was just stuff like that. And then every group found somebody to interview, some like leader in the community. And that was something teachers kind of helped with, set up those interviews. But I will say, like, that's for you guys, you have that as an option, you know, like to as one of the options in the engage level is to do an interview. And I think that was one of the best things that happened, was all these kids going face to face, and they were nervous. I mean, they were just like, I would get done like listening to these and I would be crying, like, because I was so proud, because they would be so nervous, like preparing to talk to an adult, you know, whatever. And then they would come away with just really cool information and follow-up questions and stuff like that. So that was probably one of my favorite parts of the whole thing.
And doing these interviews, the skills Jesse is talking about, students had to write questions. They had to think about how to formulate those questions, their communication skills, reaching out. These are all different things that can be connected to and really are important skills for students to be building within content areas. We asked Jesse then what project stood out overall, and the project he chose was led by one of his partner teachers. You'll hear him mention her as he speaks, and the students developed a plan for creating a composting program for their school and community gardens.
One of the projects that stands out was it's still kind of in the works, and it's involving other areas of the school. So I'd have to have Maddie should talk about this, but this group of girls came up with this idea for how they could capture a lot of the food waste that our school kind of throws out, all this food, the kids that don't eat all their lunch or whatever. And so they have this, and then we have a garden too. It's not huge, but we have like a garden at our school, and we also have like there's a little church just north of our campus that has a big garden. So they're looking at ways that they're not kind of really done. They're still working on their project. They're looking at implementing kind of like composting effort school-wide, working with the lunch ladies and stuff. So it's that's pretty cool. Like that it was actually like something they can do about this. They spent a month learning about this goal, and now it's something that's kind of carried forward into this year that they can continue to work on.
And this idea connects not just to the overall theme of sustainability that Jesse discussed, but also to science and what students could learn in science. The project he's describing actually won one of the sustainability awards last year. And so the students are working on scaling and sustaining the project with the support of that sustainability award. We finished our conversation with Jesse by asking him a little bit about advice that he would have for teachers, as well as some challenges that he faced. And so when asked for advice, he noted that it wasn't always easy, but it's important to know the whole CBS process and where students are going right from the beginning of the project.
I think that you guys have done a good job of creating these stages, and I even like the language: engage, investigate, act. Right? Engage, investigate, act. I want to say that just diving in that first year, it was hard to follow along. If you think, because you can't just show up and go, all right, now we're on to this step. It's like, and then the kids move at a different pace as well. So I want to say it was overall a very awesome experience, but it's really hard. And so the more, this is not going to encourage teachers very much to want to do this or whatever, but I will say the more work that is put in on the front end of just kind of mapping out where do you want students to be at, have some benchmark and then have hard dates on those benchmarks. What I want to say is, when I kind of figured out what we were doing, I really like this kind of flow of.
So the CBL process can be fuzzy, and each student will likely take their own direction. So they have that flow that he's talking about of engage, investigate, act. But it's important to have prepared yourself to know the process so that you can support students the entire time. We would encourage you to check out some of our past and upcoming webinars as we're working through a process of going through those three stages and having more and more resources available for them. So please stay tuned to our webinars, see the ones that the recordings are up, because those really will help you to get to know that entire process that Jesse is talking about. And as Jesse shared, taking part in the challenge isn't always easy, and there are definitely challenges along the way. And so he highlighted two challenges. One challenge he shared is differentiating the products that get turned into the challenge and students' actions. And in this case, he talks about the PowerPoint presentation that we asked teams to turn in that kind of gives an overview of their process. so that in the gallery and in the sustainability award judging process, we can know a little bit more about the projects. But he talks about how that is separate from the actual action that students are taking and making that clear for students.
One of the things that's hard for kids right now is we had to like fight this so hard last year, is they think that the final project is the PowerPoint that they're going to make, and it's like, it's hard for them to make that connection of like, no, the final project might never be finished, like the final project is for you to take action, and it might be immediate. It might be something that you can like make a difference right now, or maybe it's like you're making a commitment to just make these choices for the rest of your young adult life or whatever. So that's one of the, does that make sense? Like you guys had that PowerPoint template for them to make, and you want a PowerPoint. So when we submit a project, they have to have a PowerPoint. And so so for them, last year, I just remember just like going, no, that's not the final project. That's just your kind of presentation of what you're wanting to do and what you learned and stuff like that. It's not that your PowerPoint is the project. No, that's not.
And finally, Jesse shared that another challenge is making sure that the actions students come up with and take are things that they have the resources and the time to follow through on.
I felt a little bit last year like, man, I failed big time, because so many of the ideas that kids had just, they just didn't happen. I mean, it was like, in like they'd have a poster presentation going, this is what we're going to do. Like, I know there was one plan to like clean up a park, and they didn't even do it, like they didn't even go and do it. So it's I think for teachers, if it doesn't happen, like, for me, I just feel like, oh man, here's another way I dropped the ball, like I didn't hold these kids accountable enough to actually follow through and do the thing that they dreamed of doing, or that they said they were going to try to do,
So it's important to consider what's feasible and what students can do, even if you don't get a funding award. In this case, cleaning up a park is actually a lot more complicated than just grabbing a bag and walking around the park. There's often coordination with the parks department and different things. So it's important to have a feasible and sustainable project, which might mean putting some limitations on what students can do, or having an open conversation with them about feasibility and about what they're able to accomplish. And applying for a sustainability award can make larger projects possible, but thinking about what is our project if we have a sustainability award, but if we don't get that award, how can we still make sure that we're taking action within our community? So our team has developed a number of resources to support you with the challenge, and specifically with integrating the challenge into your classes. The Ciena Challenge Resource Library has a number of other resources that can support your students throughout the challenge. If you go to this site, you'll be taken to our library guide, where you can explore the libraries, the entire library, or specific pieces of content. And this first thing we have is that facilitator's guide that I mentioned earlier, which can really help you to get started. One really great resource that I want to highlight as we're finishing up is the Challenge Builder. And the Challenge Builder allows you to think through the different phases of challenge-based learning and plan it out. So when you're integrating in a content area, you might consider using the Challenge Builder to help you plan what limitations or parameters you might need to add to the challenge to help students be successful and align to your content area goals and your content area standards. One example might be that you limit these investigation methods. So if you're working in a science class, you might limit or encourage or require at least one of investigation methods that include things like data analysis, field research, or conducting an experiment. So you can put some parameters on, and this challenge builder might help you to do that.